The location is Ruocheng County, Xinjiang, on the southern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. Coordinates place the site at roughly 38.75 degrees north, 87.25 degrees east, one of the most remote inhabited stretches of the Chinese interior. There is no ocean within 1,000 kilometers. No port, no harbor, no navigable water. And yet the object sitting on the desert floor is a warship. It is roughly 155 meters long. The beam measures close to 20 meters. The bow rakes forward with the distinctive clipper profile of an Arleigh Burke Flight 2A destroyer. Amidships, a squared superstructure carries 4 flat panels arranged in the exact geometry of the SPY-1D phased array. A helicopter deck sits aft. Forward and aft of the deckhouse, dark rectangles mark the positions of the Mark 41 vertical launch system cells, 32 forward, 64 aft, totaling 96. The count matches. The spacing matches. Even the placement of the 5-inch Mark 45 gun on the bow matches. This is not an approximation.
This is a schematic rendered in steel and concrete. The imagery first surfaced through commercial satellite operators, Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs, and was analyzed by open-source intelligence researchers, including the team at Defense Security Asia, US NI News contributors, and independent naval analysts tracking PLA infrastructure. The assessment converged quickly. The structure is a full-scale mock-up of a US Navy DDG-51-class destroyer, purpose-built as a targeting reference for weapons testing, sensor calibration, and pilot training. The obvious question is why? Why build a target this specific, this expensive, this remote? The answer sits about 4,000 kilometers to the east in the Taiwan Strait. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the workhorse of the United States surface fleet. 73 hulls in service, another 24 on order or under construction. Every U.S. carrier strike group deployed to the Western Pacific sails with a screen of Burkes. Every ballistic missile defense patrol off Japan or Korea rides on a Burke's Aegis combat system. Every Tomahawk salvo the Navy has launched in the last 2 decades has come in large part from Burke VLS cells. If the People's Liberation Army wants to contest U.S. naval power inside the First Island chain, it has to solve the Burke problem first. That's what this desert range is for. The facility is not new to satellite watchers. An earlier version appeared in 2019 and 2020 when analysts identified a smaller mock-up of a U.S. aircraft carrier and 2 destroyer-shaped targets on rails at a separate site near Ruocheng. Those earlier targets could move. They were mounted on rail sleds, allowing PLA weapons designers to simulate a moving surface contact for missile seekers to lock onto.
The new Burke replica sits stationary, but the fidelity of its topside geometry suggests a different phase of testing. Not seeker development, terminal engagement. Think about what that means. A stationary, full-scale, topside-accurate replica of a specific U.S. warship, positioned on open desert with clear sight lines from multiple azimuths, is the ideal environment for something very specific. Rehearsing the final seconds of a missile's flight against a real Burke. The last several kilometers, where the weapon's onboard sensors have to distinguish the destroyer from clutter, from decoys, from countermeasures, and steer to the aim point that will do the most damage. The most damage, in the case of a Burke, is the deckhouse. The Aegis combat system is the nervous system of the ship. The 4 SPY-1D panels on the superstructure are the eyes. Take out the deckhouse, and the destroyer becomes a floating hull with a functioning gun and nothing else. No air defense, no missile defense, no fire control. A single successful hit at that aim point neutralizes 96 VLS cells without ever having to sink the ship. The math on that trade is brutal. and the PLA is presumably running it. Consider the physics. The SPY-1D array faces are made of thousands of individual transmit-receive modules, each contributing to the composite beam that gives the Aegis system its ability to track hundreds of targets simultaneously. Damage a single face, and you lose a quadrant of coverage.
Damage two adjacent faces, and the ship goes essentially blind on one side. A warhead detonating anywhere in the deckhouse volume, even a sub-optimal hit, produces overpressure, fragmentation, and fire propagation through cable runs and ventilation trunks that cascade through the Combat Information Center directly below. The Burke was designed in the 1980s, hardened for the Cold War threat of Soviet anti-ship missiles. It was not designed for a Mach 6 terminal phase warhead arriving on a near-vertical trajectory. Nothing afloat was. The weapons this range is likely built to service are not a mystery. China's rocket force fields the DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, the so-called carrier killers, with ranges of roughly 1,500 and 4,000 kilometers respectively. Both weapons rely on a maneuverable re-entry vehicle that must acquire and track a moving warship in its terminal phase. The PLA Navy and Air Force also field the YJ-12, YJ-18, and YJ-21 anti-ship cruise and hypersonic missiles launched from H-6 bombers, Type 055 cruisers, and Type 052D destroyers. Every one of those weapons has the same terminal problem. Find the ship, separate it from countermeasures, hit the right part of it. A full-scale, geometrically accurate replica solves that problem on the ground, cheaply, repeatedly, before any missile ever has to fly against a real US Navy hull. There is another dimension to the desert replica worth examining. Terminal seekers on modern anti-ship missiles use a combination of active radar, passive radio frequency detection, and, increasingly, imaging infrared or optical sensors. Each mode needs a reference signature. Active radar seekers need to know what a Burke's radar cross-section looks like from 30 degrees off the bow, from directly abeam, from a shallow descent angle. Passive sensors need cataloged emissions from the ship's own radars and communications suite. Optical seekers, the newest and most concerning category, need a training library of images taken from the exact geometries the missile will fly. A stationary desert replica lets PLA test aircraft and drones fly repeated passes at every conceivable angle, at every time of day, in every lighting condition, feeding a machine learning classifier the exact data set it needs to lock onto the shape of a Burke and reject everything else. That is not hypothetical. That is standard practice in Western militaries, too. It is what a modern targeting pipeline requires. The Pentagon has not commented publicly on the specific facility, but the pattern is not a surprise. Congressional testimony from Admiral John Aquilino, then commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, warned in 2023 and 2024 that Chinese military modernization was moving faster than any previous assessment predicted. The 2024 DoD Annual Report to Congress on Chinese military power devoted extensive sections to PLA anti-access and area denial infrastructure, the doctrinal framework the Pentagon abbreviates as A2/AD. This range is A2/AD made physical. It is also not the only one. Analysts have identified similar target arrays at the Dingxin test range in Gansu, at ranges near Korla, and at a naval weapons proving ground on Bohai Bay. The Bohai site includes what appears to be a mock-up of a Ford-class aircraft carrier, the newest and most expensive warship in U.S. Navy service. Every major surface combatant in the American fleet has, somewhere in the Chinese interior, a scale double waiting to be hit. Here is the uncomfortable part. The construction of these targets is not a secret. The PLA is not hiding them.
They sit in open desert, visible from any commercial satellite that passes overhead. Which means the message is at least partly deliberate.
Beijing is not merely preparing to strike U.S. warships. It wants Washington to know it is preparing. That's not a flaw in the strategy. That's the strategy. Deterrence works by demonstrated capability. If the PLA can credibly signal that any Burke sailing into the Taiwan Strait faces a rehearsed, calibrated, target-tested missile threat, then the deterrent value of a U.S. surface combatant on that patrol drops. The ship doesn't have to be sunk. The threat of the sinking has to be believable enough to change American decision-making before the shooting starts. You might wonder why the U.S. Navy doesn't simply avoid the strait, operate carriers from beyond the range of Chinese ballistic missiles, launch strikes from safe standoff. That is, in fact, the emerging concept. Distributed maritime operations, the doctrine the Navy has been building towards since roughly 2017, disperses surface combatants across wider areas of ocean, complicates targeting, and pushes carriers farther offshore. The problem is that Taiwan is 180 kilometers from the Chinese coast. The DF-26 ranges 4,000 kilometers. There is no ocean in the Western Pacific that is truly outside the missile envelope. There is only ocean that is harder to target. Which brings the analysis back to the Burke. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the platform the Navy relies on to shoot down what China is planning to launch. The SM-6 Block IB, the SM-3 Block IIA, and the layered Aegis ballistic missile defense architecture are the countermeasures. A Burke on station in the Philippine Sea or the East China Sea is not just a strike platform. It's the shield for the carrier behind it. If China can degrade the Burke, the entire strike group becomes exposed. That is why the desert replica matters more than the earlier carrier mock-ups. Sinking a carrier is a stated PLA ambition. Blinding the escorts is the operational prerequisite. Consider the sequence of a plausible opening move. In the first minutes of a Taiwan contingency, PLA rocket force salvos would not be aimed exclusively or even primarily at carriers. They would be aimed at the ships that protect the carriers. Suppress the Aegis picket first. Overwhelm the SM-3 and SM-6 magazines with saturation raids. Force the Burkes to expend interceptors on decoys and lower priority threats. Then, and only then, does the second wave arrive against the high-value units behind them. That sequencing is standard in any anti-ship doctrine that assumes a layered defense. It is also what the desert replica implies the PLA has been rehearsing. Not a single missile, not a single hit. A coordinated raid that treats the destroyer screen as the primary obstacle and the carrier as the objective on the other side of it. The U.S. Navy's public response has been posture, not press release. Since early 2025, Indo-PACOM has maintained near-continuous carrier presence in the Western Pacific, rotating the USS Ronald Reagan replacement, the USS George Washington, alongside the USS Carl Vinson and USS Nimitz strike groups. Freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait have continued at roughly one transit every 4 to 6 weeks, most recently by the destroyers USS Milius, DDG-69, and USS Higgins, DDG-76. Each transit is announced by 7th Fleet Public Affairs. Each transit passes within range of the weapons the desert replica exists to service. There is a real argument to be made, one the Navy will not make publicly, that the freedom of navigation transits have become the most heavily rehearsed military event in the modern Pacific. The Burkes rehearse, the PLA rehearses. Both sides know exactly what the other is training for. The transits happen anyway. That's not a broken deterrent. That's what a functioning one looks like. The satellite imagery of the Ruo Chang facility is now roughly a year old in its most recent public form,
dating to mid-2025 releases from commercial imaging providers. The replica remains in place. Ancillary structures have been added, instrumentation towers and support buildings consistent with a working weapons range rather than an abandoned mock-up. The site is active. Look closely at what those ancillary structures imply. Instrumentation towers arranged around a target array typically house high-speed cameras, telemetry receivers, and blast effect sensors.
They capture what happens in the milliseconds around impact, the exact data a weapons designer needs to refine a warhead's fusing, its fragmentation pattern, its detonation altitude. You do not build that kind of infrastructure to look at a static mock-up. You build it to catch data from something arriving at high speed. Which means the Ruochang site is not merely a training aid. It is a live-fire proving ground, or is being prepared to become one. Whether the PLA has actually flown a warhead into the replica is a separate question, one the imagery does not currently answer. But the surrounding architecture is consistent with a facility built to do exactly that. What the site tells the Pentagon is not new, but it is now concrete. The People's Liberation Army has specific knowledge of the Burke's configuration. It has invested significant resources in rehearsing engagements against that specific class. It expects to face that class in a Taiwan contingency. It is preparing accordingly. The counter-question, the one hanging over every Pacific Fleet planning cell, is what the US Navy is doing to change what shows up in the next satellite pass. The Flight 3 Burke, with the Spy-6 radar and expanded VLS handling, is entering service. The Constellation-class frigate is meant to add a lower-cost surface combatant to the mix. The Zumwalt-class destroyers are being reconfigured to carry hypersonic conventional prompt strike weapons. The Virginia-class attack submarines with the Virginia payload module will roughly triple the Tomahawk load of the earlier hulls. Every one of those platforms exists, in part, because of what sits in the Taklamakan. There is also a quieter countermove underway, one that does not appear in shipbuilding budgets. Electronic warfare upgrades to the existing Burke fleet, the SEWIP Block 3 system, being fielded across DDG-51 hulls through the late 2020s, are meant to disrupt the seekers the desert replica is being used to calibrate. Decoy programs like the Nulka active missile decoy and the newer MK-234 have been prioritized for Western Pacific deployment. The Navy's investment in directed energy, the 60-kilowatt Helios laser mounted on USS Preble, DDG-88, tested in operational conditions in 2024, is the start of a defensive layer designed specifically for the kind of saturation attack the Ruochang range implies. Each of those countermeasures attempts to break the assumption baked into the desert mock-up, that the ship in the imagery will behave the same way in combat as it does on the schematic. The whole point of a targeting rehearsal is to eliminate uncertainty. The whole point of countermeasure development is to put uncertainty back in. Return to the desert. The imagery shows no personnel, no vehicles, no activity in the frame. Just the shape of an American warship, drawn full size in a place no American warship will ever sail. Somewhere off the coast of Taiwan, on any given day, the real hull it was built to imitate is underway. Steel gray, crew of about 320, 96 VLS cells loaded, radar sweeping. The Burke on station does not know, in any operational sense, that its double exists. It does not need to. The Navy that deploys it does. And on the next satellite pass, the desert ship will still be there, waiting for a war that has not yet started, in an ocean that isn't there. For a moment, neither side wants to see arrive.